Hi there, Mike from Greenway. Today I wanted to talk with you about the idea of EVs or electric vehicles and their suitability in the rural environment, so out of the city. So there's a lot of strong views that people have on this topic, and when you have a situation where you're driving your electric vehicle in the city, where your distances are not very great, the ease of adoption of EVs in that scenario can be fairly easy to adopt an EV when you're traveling within a city. Your average daily drive is say less than 30 miles round trip per day. Pretty easy to do. But let's consider the situation in a rural area where basically the distances are a lot further and whether or not it is suitable for that kind of scenario. Now, there's a lot of different potential situations that a person can find themselves in a rural scenario, and all the way from commuting from a small town into a nearby large city, or commuting within the rural area, and that could be any distance. You may be driving 90 miles each way to get to work. Or the other scenario is where you're using it for other rural applications, not commuting. So, for example, if you're hauling trailers, you're hauling equipment, you're doing other hauling activities that normally you would use a pickup truck for or other large vehicle. So there's a lot of different scenarios that can happen in the rural setting, but today I wanted to pick on one particular one that I'm most familiar with, and that is the situation where you work in the city, but yet you live in the rural area and you're commuting a fairly good distance, fairly long distance to work. So this is the situation I found myself in, and I was using a lot of fuel to get myself to work and back every day. My average daily mileage was about 60 miles round trip, 60, which is a fair number of miles, certainly longer than the average person in the city travels. And I was using a lot of money on fuel. So I was looking at how I can save some money on fuel. And this is 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. I decided in 2013 to buy an electric vehicle for my commuting purposes. And the only thing this car did was drive from home to work and then work to home. Sometimes on the way home, I would stop at shopping to get groceries or some other errands. Sometimes at lunchtime, I would go out for lunch nearby to work. But that's the primary purpose of the vehicle. So another thing that I had fortunately able to do was to charge at home and to charge at work. So what that effectively does is doubles the range of the electric vehicle I had at the time. Now, in 2013, there were very few electric vehicles available. Basically, there was the Tesla Model S, which had just come out in 2012, and those were very expensive, and just didn't have the money for that. The next one was a Nissan Leaf. That one came out in 2011, and so that was an option, but those were still at the time fairly expensive. Even around $50,000 for a Nissan Leaf, and the range though on those was quite a bit less. Tesla, the range was somewhere around 250 miles on a charge, which is a lot, and it took quite easily can handle that daily commute I was doing. The Nissan Leaf had a range of around 70 to 80 miles, and that as well, that car was also had some cost to it. It was fairly expensive, 50,000 at the time. And then the other car option was the Mitsubishi i-MiEV, which is just a small little commuter car, and that one ended up being in the right price range for me to afford to purchase. So that's the one I got, and I drove that car for several years afterwards. And so in the situation I was in, where I'm driving a consistent commute every day, driving from the rural community into the city, and I'm able to charge the car up and then driving back home every evening and then charging at home, it quite handily covered that distance. And really in the summer, actually, I didn't even need to charge in the workplace because the car had enough range to do a full round trip. In the winter, though, when the temperatures were dropping, I was using a lot more power for heat, and so therefore I would need to charge during the workday in order to make it home. So that's an example of a scenario where it's a rural situation where an electric vehicle could be a really good option for you. Now, when we got that electric vehicle, we had two vehicles in the family, and we kept my wife's a gas vehicle. So if we needed to do any kind of other long distance travel, we still had the gas vehicle as a second backup vehicle. But for my daily commuting, which was Monday to Friday, 50 weeks a year, this little electric car was getting me to work. And so with the cost I paid for the car, which was compared to now, it's quite expensive, but it was at the time the cheapest one available. And you look at the amount of money I was spending on fuel, I was spending somewhere $250 to $300 a month on fuel at the time. Once I got the electric vehicle, that bill went away entirely, and then I was just paying for electricity, and the electricity rates around where I am is 8 cents per kilowatt hour, which is quite low. So the cost really dropped dramatically. It was 80 to 90% drop in the cost of electricity. So the other thing was with the car, it was quite reliable and quite easy to maintain. Really, there's no oil changes and no other kind of maintenance that's needed. We had to, check the tires. I did buy a set of winter tires for the winter time, top up the washer fluid, and there was really no major maintenance that was required on the car during my ownership of it. And so you might ask, well, after all those years, so I drove it. I had around, I think 75 to 80,000 miles on it when I sold it. And you might ask, well, what about the battery? How many times did you have to replace that? Well, I never replaced the battery in it. It lasted the whole time. And as the years passed on, there was a slight degradation. I had an app that I could load into my Android phone and connect to the car and see how much it had been degrading. But without that, I may not have noticed the degradation of the battery. It was, it had a measurement that was going into the car's computer and reading in terms of the amp hours remaining in the battery. And by the way, the car itself, when it was brand new, had the smallest, almost the smallest pure electric vehicle battery around. It had 16 kilowatt hours, 1/6. At that time, the Teslas had up to 85 kilowatt hours, and the Nissan Leafs at the time had 24, and my car had 16. So it was quite a tiny little battery, but it still did the job and got me back and forth to work. And so that's an example of a scenario where if you're in a two-car family and you have a situation where you're just driving back and forth to work all the time, even on the weekends, if we have to do a trip into the city, we could still take that vehicle and get the full round trip, except for when it was super cold outside. Although where I worked in the city was quite far from my house, the closest part of the city was actually quite a bit closer. So even in the winter, I could still do a round trip to the city to do grocery shopping and other errands. It did save me quite a bit of money over the period of time that I had it in terms of fuel, and then I did end up selling it to someone who is continuing to drive it today, as far as I know. And I, at that time, then had a Nissan Leaf to drive, and by that time they had come down to more reasonable prices, and I was looking for something that had a little bit more range and a bit more capability. So I got into the Nissan Leaf, which had a 24 kilowatt hour battery, which is still pretty small compared to modern EVs, but it was definitely an upgrade at that time. So that's an example of a rural situation that can allow you to drive electric vehicles. I think perhaps in a different video, I'll explore other scenarios where you may be commuting for even further distances than I was, or perhaps you're not commuting on such a consistent basis to the same place all the time. It gets a bit more difficult to predict, if you were, say, for example, let's say you operate a delivery service in a rural area, that becomes very difficult then to predict where you're going to be going, how many miles of range you'll need, and how many miles of range you'll need on every day. And then also the other option or the other scenario I mentioned is, in the rural area, sometimes, if you have a pickup truck and you're doing hauling, trailers and that sort of thing, there are EVs now that are pickup trucks like the F-150 Lightning and the Tesla Cybertruck and the Chevy Silverado EV. But in the reading I've done on those, the range is a little bit limited just because of the battery size. They do have very large batteries, but once you hook up a trailer, the range does decrease quite a bit. So anyways, we're going to explore those in a different video. I thought I'd bring this up for those folks who are commuting into the city and doing a routine drive like that. That's quite predictable, so it works. Worked great for me, and I think it could be a potential option for folks looking at moving into an electric vehicle. So I hope you found this video interesting or informative. If you did, I appreciate it if you can give me a thumbs up and consider subscribing for future videos. Thanks for watching and have a great day.